It's recording. So hello, everyone. Thank you again for coming to our Utah Historical Society Perspective Speaker Series. Today, I'm excited to have Chris Hansen join us today to share some of his research on the Occidental and the Assembly Club and Black baseball in Utah. I'll go to my notes. So yes, I'm Monique Davila, the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Utah Historical Society. And so as I mentioned, we're excited to have Chris Hansen with us. And Chris Hansen is an Ogden, Utah native, and he received his bachelor's degree in history from Weber State University and his master's degree in urban planning from Eastern Washington University. Professionally, he has worked in the field of historic preservation for the past 25 years. And as many of you know, and you have some fans already in this presentation, he works for SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office. Chris is a member of the Society for American Baseball Research. And so today, Chris will present his research on the 1905 Ogden Assembly African-American baseball team. He'll explore the social, cultural, political, and economic events and history that led to the development of the team, and also talk about the team's overarching legacy in Utah. So before Chris starts, I just want to let you know that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A box below. It should be on the bottom of the Zoom chat, and it's a little box with a question mark that says Q&A. You're also welcome to use the chat function for any Q&A and comments. We will leave time at the end of this presentation to address all those questions. Oops, and yeah, so I'll go ahead and pass it on to Chris. So go ahead, Chris. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm excited to be here, and I thank Monique and Utah Historical Society for inviting me to present. This is an exciting time of year for baseball fans, as spring training will soon get underway, and now that the Super Bowl's over. I guess if you're not a big baseball fan, hopefully you will be after this presentation. Just kidding, sort of, but I hope you do take something away from this. I've added a lot of photographs, images of documents, and other slides as I've been able to collect a lot over the years that hopefully help tell this story visually. I hope it's not overload, but there's just a lot of great information out there that I wanted to share. So there is a Utah Historical Quarterly article that I wrote on this topic that was published last spring as well. Here's the cover of that issue. So jumping into it, my presentation today, as Monique mentioned, is on all Black baseball teams in Utah, with a concentration on the Ogden Assembly baseball team of 1905. So I'll focus on all Black baseball teams rather than going into too much detail about the individual Black players who played on integrated white teams in Utah. You see that on the cover of this quarterly. And here's another example featuring the 1890 Ogden semi-pro team. I'll mention a few of the more prominent players on white teams, such as Robert Dobbs here, who's featured in this photo. And before jumping right into the Ogden Assembly Club team, for some context, I'll provide a brief history of baseball in Utah and talk a little bit about the other largely forgotten teams. Here's a slide that provides an overview historically of Black teams in Utah. Beginning in 1897, a year following many converging events, such as the Supreme Court's Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the separate but equal clause as it's known, and also 1 year after Utah officially entered the Union, Black baseball began in earnest in Utah. Prior to that time, there had been no competitive teams composed of all Black players in the state or territory, although Black baseball had been played in America since the 1850s. And white baseball had been officially established as early as 1864 in Salt Lake City, with the creation of the Union Baseball Club. And if you watch Ken Burns' epic 9-part documentary on baseball, he claimed that baseball was one of Joseph Smith's and the Latter-day Saints' favorite games, which they undoubtedly continued to play as soon as they settled into this state. And the game in Utah steadily grew in popularity during the 1870s and 1880s. And I really like the image on the right. It's a Deseret News image from the 1890s of an LDS woman playing baseball at an outing of the Salt Lake LDS Third Ward. The caption reads, "Slide Nellie Slide," which is a play on a song titled "Slide Kelly Slide," about an all-star baseball player in the late 1800s named Mike King Kelly. Nonetheless, by the late 1800s, baseball was big time in Utah. As I noted, in 1897, 4 black baseball teams were created in Utah, and it started with the Fort Douglas Browns team, which was made up of Buffalo soldiers of the 24th Army Infantry stationed at the fort in 1897. They arrived in Salt Lake a year earlier in 1896. The team was formed largely for recreation, and they also had something to prove to the skeptical population of the Salt Lake Valley. Here's a map and photo of the field they played on in 1897. It was pretty rough, basically just weeds and dirt. But the Fort Douglas Browns team ended up winning over the hearts of baseball fans in the region and became one of the most respected clubs in Utah during that era. Some of the 24th Infantry had played baseball previously when they were stationed at Fort Bayard in New Mexico. And although I found no actual photos of the team during its time in Utah in the late 1800s, there are a lot of sketches of the team in newspapers, as can be seen here. And while I have no photos of the team at Fort Douglas, here are some of the images I found of the 24th Infantry team, shortly after they left Utah in the early 1900s. And, one person I did want to highlight associated with the Fort Douglas Browns team is a man by the name of Samuel Cropper. Cropper was born in 1862 in Texas and grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. He joined the Army in 1882 in Baltimore and served in the 10th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry Buffalo Soldier units, with a career spanning over 30 years. He traveled the United States and the world in service, and although he did not play baseball, he was a fan of the sport and became a popular umpire, umpiring games wherever he was stationed, including here in Utah, Alaska, Montana, and New York. He umpired most of the games Fort Douglas played in 1897. The story I wanted to share about Cropper happened in 1902 in Skagway, Alaska, where he had been stationed with the 24th Infantry right after they had left Utah, because I think it illustrates what society was like at the time, and also what a violent game baseball could be. Cropper had sought to be an umpire in a newly formed Dawson League in Alaska, which is a semi-professional white baseball league, and was known as the northernmost and closest league to the North Pole. So they often played sunlit games after 7 p.m., which was rare for baseball games to be played that late at night at the time. But things didn't go so well for Cropper in the Dawson League. As was later reported in the Butte, Montana Daily Post, Cropper was beaten up severely by a second baseman who was dissatisfied with a call, and he was mobbed by the entire team. Despite his pleas to the security and police at the game for protection, the Butte paper noted it seemed everybody thought it was funny to see him being used for a punching bag and did nothing to come to his aid. So Cropper then resigned from the league, but undaunted, he later moved on and continued to umpire elsewhere, mainly for black baseball teams and games where he had more support. So moving on to the next team that was formed in 1897, that was the Black Rubes, a team from the African-American sector of Salt Lake City, which is located near the center of downtown and concentrated on dense urban blocks with Commercial Street near the center of it. Bruce Johnson, a prominent African-American businessman and politician in Utah, organized the team and was captained by his friend, Charles Catlin, who helped oversee Johnson's saloon on Commercial Street. Previously, Johnson and Catlin were involved in promoting boxing in Utah. The creation of the Black Rubes was more of a business venture than anything. As soon as the team was established, Johnson is reported wagering bets as much as $250 a game to play teams mainly targeting the Fort Douglas Browns. And the team name Rubes cracks me up, but that term had become popularized in the US in the 1890s, and especially with baseball teams and players, such as famed Major League Baseball pitcher Rube Waddell. And Johnson likely chose the term as his team was a group of inexperienced players without a lot of baseball know-how, as far as I can tell. Another team, the Salt Lake Monarchs, was created by Joseph J. Bamberger when he was 17 years old. He was the nephew of mining magnate, railroad owner, and later governor of Utah, Simon Bamberger. He organized a black team by the name of the Salt Lake Monarchs, as I mentioned, and Bamberger put together the Monarchs and a white team, which he called the Mascots, and also developed a baseball field to play on in the north end of town near what was known as Beck's Hot Springs. Joseph's goal was to try to grow the game of baseball in Utah and make Beck's Hot Springs a more popular destination, as his uncle's railroad company, the Bamberger Railroad, had one of its key early stops located at the springs. And the fourth black team that was created in 1897 was the Fort Duchesne Giants, or sometimes referred to as the Grays. This was formed by the 9th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers who had been stationed at the fort for several years, which is located in the Uinta Basin, 150 miles east of Salt Lake. The soldiers would often play recreationally at the fort and were encouraged to participate in athletics by their headquarters in Colorado. And after word spread that the Fort Douglas 24th Infantry created a formidable team in Salt Lake, the 9th Cavalry did so too to face off against the Fort Douglas Browns, in addition to playing some practice games versus other teams too. In fact, one of the players from the 9th Cavalry Fort Duchesne team, their catcher, Henry Jackson, used to be in the 24th Infantry and played ball for the Browns team when they were stationed in New Mexico, as I mentioned earlier. The 9th Cavalry team was managed by Lieutenant James Kavanaugh and captained by James Barry. Once again, I haven't been able to locate images of the 9th Cavalry team while they were in Utah. But once again, I found many after their move out of Utah in the early 1900s. There's some of those. And I've also found some military records. An example is seen on this slide. This lists the names of all those on the team who went from Fort Duchesne to Fort Douglas in Salt Lake to play baseball in May of 1897. It's kind of hard to read, but it states that they traveled to Salt Lake to repair telegraph lines and to play sports on this particular trip. I suppose they had to have an official reason to travel, the telegraph repairs, but the real reason undoubtedly was to play baseball. Thusly, the year 1897 was a watershed moment for African-American baseball in Utah. Unfortunately, due to the outbreak of the Spanish-American War and other changes in the Army in 1898, the Fort Duchesne and Fort Douglas teams were largely dissolved. J.J. Bamberger moved on to other things, even if his Monarchs team did try to make a run of it in 1898, albeit unsuccessfully. And Bruce Johnson's team, the Black Rubes, couldn't gain any traction either. In fact, he probably lost quite a bit of money in 1897 playing against the likes of Fort Douglas. And between 1898 and 1902, there were no new all-black teams organized. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the more talented black players, if they agreed to, not all were interested. They did play on other, largely white yet integrated teams, in which they often faced hostile opponents and animosity from their own teammates. For example, Steam Drill Jackson played for the predominantly white Salt Lake Elks team of 1898 after he had been a star player on the Fort Douglas Browns team in 1897. Some other notable black players who had spots on integrated teams in Utah's history include George William Castone, who played on an 1888 Salt Lake City team and later played for integrated teams in Colorado and Kansas, and for black clubs such as the Lincoln Giants in Nebraska and the Cuban Giants in the northeastern United States. Robert Dobbs, who played for the 1890 Ogden Semi-Pro Club, made his way to Utah from Colorado, where he had played for teams in Colorado Springs and Aspen. He had later become a prolific professional boxer in the United States and in Europe. In 1892, George Taylor, he was a future star of the nationally renowned black teams, the Page Finch Giants and the St. Paul Colored Gophers. He played briefly for the Ogden team. And later on in 1910, Hiram LeGrone was the star player for the Granite High School baseball team in the Salt Lake area. And he was actually offered a spot on the Salt Lake Occidentals Club, a team I will talk about later, which he denied, or declined, I should say. Then in 1903, baseball movement picked up once again in urban Salt Lake's African-American sector of town, and a new team was formed. It was an aggregation of colored all-stars, as they were termed, with men who were associated with this part of the city. And they started to play as a team against white teams stretching from Utah County to Weaver County. Mostly to advertise their company, the Keith O'Brien Department Store, a large early Utah retail store, sponsored the team, and they wore Keith O'Brien uniforms. The Keith O'Brien Browns played throughout 1903 and started up again in 1904. Halfway through the 1904 season, the African American Social Club, the America's Club, took ownership of the team. Bruce Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, who had organized the 1897 Black Rubes team, he was the co-owner of the America's Club. The important early development of the Keith O'Brien and America's Browns team was a combination of Joe Burns and Hayes Gann as the battery, or pitcher and catcher combo, starting in 1903. They were two of the most prominent black baseball players in Utah over the following decade. And never shying away from hyperbole, this team was calling themselves the Middle West champs and the colored champs of the West in 1904. They were managed by George Simmons, also the club's right fielder, who was employed as a waiter for a restaurant in Commercial Street. It appeared the team would continue the next season in 1905 as they played one early game in March as the Salt Lake Browns against a black team 30 miles north of Salt Lake, the Ogden Chocolates. However, the Browns players soon joined forces with the Chocolates to create one super team in Utah that became known as the Ogden Assembly Club for the 1905 season, which is the main topic today. So some background on the Ogden Assembly Club baseball team. The team was sponsored and managed by the social club of the same name. The Ogden Assembly Social Club was incorporated in 1902 as an African-American association to promote social intercourse among its members and associates, and included African-Americans who lived in and around Ogden and those from elsewhere associated with the railroad. It replaced another black social club dubbed the Eureka Club that was at the same location. Assembly catered to the large population of porters and waiters making their way to the city. Ogden was a major junction for the Union Pacific and other railroads. By the turn of the 20th century, the city had become a common resting spot for many blacks from across the nation working the railroad because of its geographic location at the crossroads of the West, clubs like Assembly that catered to them, and because Ogden had a dismantled Pullman car in the middle of the Union Station freight yard where porters could lodge. The impact of the railroad on Ogden and on the African-American community in Utah cannot be understated. And for some perspective, there were about 50 blacks living in Ogden in 1900. And by 1910, the number had quadrupled to over 200. So a lot of growth, percentage-wise, being experienced when the Assembly team was formed. The Assembly Club was housed along Lower 25th Street. Lower 25th Street, located near the hub of the railroad and the Union Station, was the heart of the segregated black and immigrant population of Ogden. As 25th Street historian Val Hawley noted, one of the railroad's most enduring legacies in Ogden is the coalescence of an African-American community in the blocks near the Union Station. The two-story club building, which was visible as one departed the train at the Ogden Union Station, featured a saloon, club rooms, cold and hot baths, a cafe, and a barber shop. Many notable Utah African-Americans were involved with the club, including William Carter, Clarence Ernst, Lawrence Fair, William Houseben, Samuel Poole, Frank Turner, and Charles Woods. Most of them, along with the baseball players they sponsored in 1905, were born in the South during the Civil War or Reconstruction era. They spent their formative years during the early Jim Crow period, making their way to Ogden via train at the turn of the 20th century. The Ogden Assembly Club operated in Ogden from 1902 until 1917, when it ultimately shut down due to progressive era politics and saloon and club clampdowns on 25th Street in the city at the time, the enactment of prohibition in Utah, and the impact of the outbreak of World War I and the U.S. involvement in it. The more well-known in Ogden and Utah lore, the Porters and Waiters Club would soon then pick up where the Assembly Club left off. So, interested in athletics largely as a business opportunity and for entertainment and a sense of pride. The Assembly Club initially became involved in organized sports in 1904 when it hosted boxer Ruth Turner from Stockton, California. Turner had fought for the lightweight championship belt just a couple of years prior against Joe Gans in 1902. Turner was said, pound for pound at the time, to have the strongest punch. Turner lodged at the Assembly Club building, and they provided him a place to train in the second floor clubroom spaces before his fight against Boston's Barney Mullen. Turner easily defeated Mullen, and he was the first of many quality fighters Assembly hosted over the years. Boxing was a popular sport in Ogden and Salt Lake, and black baseball and boxing were in many ways intertwined during that era. So as I mentioned, it was after the loosely gathered Salt Lake Browns and Ogden Chocolates game in March of 1905 that the Ogden Assembly Club team was officially formed, with George Dover, who's pictured here. He was the Assembly Social Club proprietor and baseball team manager and first baseman. He took his pick of players from both the Salt Lake Browns and the Ogden Chocolates to create this team. And, I won't delve too deeply into the individual games they played, just some interesting highlights that was provided by the newspaper. But the 1905 season was the only complete year Ogden Assembly played ball, and I'll tell you why that was the case shortly. But during their first game of the season against the local amateur team, the Ogden Advertisers, it was clear that Assembly was trying to establish its lineup. Local newspapers quipped that Assembly appeared to be bamfuzzled, quote unquote, at times during their first game, and even poked fun at one of their players who inexplicably slid into first base, stating, "He evidently forgot that there is no need of touching the batter on his way to first, and shutting his eyes and aiming straight for a craggy point in the distant Wasatch Mountains," paper noted, "he launched forth through the air while the grandstand laughed themselves hoarse." In their third game of the season, in their reporting of the game, the Salt Lake Tribune stated that professional minor league Ogden Lobsters team beat Assembly 8-3, and that the pitcher Hastings made monkeys out of all those who faced him. Here are some images of the Ogden Lobsters team that I mentioned that Assembly played that made the papers in 1905. And I'll say that the Lobsters team manager, a guy by the name of Frank Gimlin, was a longtime supporter of black teams. He was a good guy, a big time supporter over the years. And another point I want to make is that newspapers tended to be uneven and inconsistent, but overall did a pretty good job covering Assembly, regularly praised their play, and kept interest, in the team high, although sometimes they reported with racist overtones, as the previous Monkeys remark could be interpreted. But early on, they treated the team kind of as a novelty, but later on they treated them more seriously. And no other Utah black sports entity prior to Assembly received as much press by the papers, with dozens of articles written about the team during their 1905 run. Of course, baseball at the time was as popular as ever in the state, and more space was dedicated to the game by this time in newspapers. Just some of the articles. Here's a box score of an Assembly game from 1905. Gotta love box scores. And here's some of the headlines from that year. about assembly games. And so, teams would often make their way from Salt Lake to Ogden to play assembly, with the Denver and Rio Grande even running special fare excursion rates for Salt Lake fans to attend games in Ogden. Once the train arrived in Ogden and fans departed, a trolley car awaited them with a direct line to Glenwood Park. Assembly had worked to deal with the park managers to play their home games there in 1905. As a side note, J.J. Bamberger, mentioned previously, was one of the original developers of Glenwood Park. And Glenwood was located where Lower and Far Park is situated today near 17th Street in Ogden. And, one of the more interesting games Assembly played was in early May against the amateur Morgan Heiners team, Morgan being located 15 miles east of Ogden. The Heiners team composed of 9 brothers, coached by their father, Daniel. He was a local merchant, politician, property owner, and religious leader. And it was Assembly's only game on a Saturday of the season, as the Heiners would not play on Sunday due to their religious beliefs. And it's worth noting that Assembly games were most often played on Sunday, afternoon, after church, for leisure and entertainment, as, this was often the only day off of work for many of the players and fans. And, Assembly won that game against Morgan handily, by the way. The press particularly took a liking to Joe Robinson, the team shortstop. Here's their description during a game midseason. Said the most spectacular play of the game that set the grandstand to howling with enthusiasm was a pretty catch by Robinson, the colored shortstop. Levitt hit a hot liner straight out, close to second bag. It looked like a safe hit, but Robinson, with a bound, reached out until it appeared as though he were going to fall. When he righted himself, the horsehide was snugly tucked into his big mitt. This particular colored boy is one of the best shortstops that ever wore a uniform on the Ogden Diamond. He covers the ground in good shape and is as sure as most of them in like position. Assembly played this game and most of their games for money, as the sports editors of papers noted that side bets of $50 to $250 per game were often wagered. The papers also often reported, and I think often, over focusing on this aspect of the game, that games would feature sideshows of vaudevillian or burlesque show, shadow ball performances to entertain spectators and to lure fans to future games. But with a sense of pride, the team had the support of the African-American community in Utah. Ahead of one game, ace pitcher Hayes Gann sent word to the Salt Lake Tribune that, quote, he is personally prepared to wipe the ground with the Vincent Knotts Baseball Club at Calder's Park this afternoon and to make the shoe peddlers look like 17 cases of misfits. There will be a barbecue, and the shoe fellers can have what is left of the ox to make Oxfords for the rest of the summer. The barbecue he is referring to was sponsored and hosted by 2 African-American churches in Salt Lake, the African Methodist Episcopal and Calvary Baptist African-American churches. I must say, though, that there was not much to celebrate, as Assembly lost in a pitcher's duel in true dead ball era baseball fashion with a score of 2-1. And the final game of the year came on Labor Day against the Salt Lake Dubay Tailors. The season-ending Tailors game was one of several features during a free day of entertainment at the Salt Lake Palace Park on Labor Day, with the Assembly team now a popular attraction. So after a rocky start, Assembly did find its way during the 1905 season, playing about 20 games, roughly splitting wins and losses, while dividing play between their home field in Ogden and different parks in Salt Lake. The team earned the respect of newspapers and fans in Utah. Despite some concerns with gambling, there were no issues with fighting, unfair play, and other problems, as many worried. Although teams and leagues were segregated, numerous clubs at varying levels in different leagues throughout the state were willing to play Assembly, both for money and for experience against a quality team. And here's a list of games that were reported on, and there are undoubtedly, other scrimmages and practice games that weren't reported on. And, with the opportunity to play baseball, there is a great deal of interest from many athletes, from, experienced players to beginners. In fact, the team fielded over 3 dozen different players over the course of the 1905 season. It featured men from Ogden, Salt Lake, and surrounding areas, as well as some who made their way through Ogden working for the railroad. With the word of the opportunity to play ball in the Beehive State, certainly passing through the trains. Denver boxer Kid Bell even made a few guest appearances for Assembly when in town for boxing matches. And, I just wanted to mention, some of the stars in the Assembly team. There were four, essentially players who could be considered stars. One was Claude Burns, and he was the only Utah native on the team, born in Salt Lake in 1881. He was a versatile athlete playing across the outfield, and he was known as a strong hitter. And he worked as a musician and as an actor. And later on in life, he moved to Portland and then Seattle, where he passed away in 1968. Joe Burns, the team's catcher and assistant manager, was also a boxing promoter, working with fighters such as Jack Johnson. He was a native of Kansas City, Missouri, born in 1879, and his father, David, was a servant of Abraham Lincoln in the White House during his presidency. The Burns family made their way to Utah in about 1900. Joe later moved to Seattle also, where he helped run a couple of black clubs and restaurants, and he passed away there in 1955. Hayes Gann was the team's ace pitcher. He appeared in more than half of Assembly's games. He was originally from Indianapolis, and he ended up living in Los Angeles in 1911. He had stayed in LA after the Salt Lake Occidentals' 1910 winter season there. I'll talk more about that team in a minute. But he stayed in LA to work as a coachman and servant for the Gorham Tufts family, one of the wealthiest families in LA. And the Tufts family became famous at the time because of a scandal. Gorham Tufts was the leader of a cult and tried to embezzle money from his rich wife, among other things. It's a long sordid tale, but Hayes Gann actually provided an affidavit that led to Mr. Tufts' arrest. It was quite the story. But, here's one of the many articles on the story that made the news nationwide at the time. And the other interesting note about the Tufts is that you may recognize the house in which they lived in and where Hayes Gann worked. It's the house, at least its image, that was used for the original Addams Family series. And Joe Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, the team's stellar shortstop, he made his way to Ogden from the state of Washington, where he had previously been a boxer. He ended up moving to Idaho in the 19-teens and worked as a boxing trainer, a porter, and as a barber later on. And, I also wanted to mention that Idaho and Utah, particularly, Pocatello and Ogden, were closely connected at the time due to their proximity and because of the railroad industry. And, just one other player I wanted to mention, although he wasn't necessarily a star of the team, he only filled in or played briefly, was Sato Bills. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Here you can see him featured in one of the lineups. In fact, I've been able to put the life stories together for about 15 of the men who played for the Assembly team. And they lived incredible lives. And Sato Bills, he lived an extraordinary life. And he is the only Assembly player who was buried in Ogden, buried at the Ogden Cemetery. There's a recent photo of his gravestone. He's actually the most recent player I researched, and I think his story is worth telling. He was born in Bolivar, Tennessee during the Civil War in 1862. He was born the son of slave parents, Angelina and Alfred. They were slaves on one of the most prominent plantations in the country, a plantation owned by John Houston Bills, who was friends with James K. Polk, Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston, Jefferson Davis, and others. And, reading through John Bill's journal is quite fascinating. Sato and his parents lived in the attic of John Houston Bill's primary residence, which was known as the Pillars. On the upper right is an exterior image of the Pillars, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And on the bottom right is a circa 1970s photo of the attic where Sato was born and lived. Plantation owner John Houston Bills actually takes interest in Sato at a very young age. Reading John's diary, he shows emotion towards Sato throughout his life, such as when Sato fell very ill at the age of 3, and he helped take care of him. And he enrolled Sato into school when he turned 7 years old, which was unusual as he didn't do that for anybody else on his plantation. And when Sato's dad moved away and his mom then passed away, Sato went to live with John's eldest daughter until Sato eventually moved to Chicago in his late teens to work as a cook in a railroad-related restaurant there. In Chicago, excuse me. In Chicago, he married a well-known African-American suffragist, Kizzy Bills. He then left Kizzy and started a relationship with a white woman, Hannah Erickson. And Hannah and Sato in 1902 moved to Ogden, where Sato worked as a cook and then as the head chef for the Pullman Railroad service out of Ogden. They were later married in Iowa, as interracial marriages were allowed there. And Sato died in Ogden in 1923, leaving behind his wife and 5 children. As I mentioned, he was buried in the Ogden Cemetery, and he is also the only player on the assembly team who actually lived outside of the 8-block or so area radius of the Union Station in 25th Street. He and his wife owned a home near Harrison Boulevard and 23rd Street. So hopefully that gives a little insight into a few of the men who played for Assembly. Not much has been written about African-American individuals in Utah during the early 1900s. So it's been edifying to discover some of the lives that they lived and the impact they've had in our history. The assembly team had several ingredients that ensured their success. They had high caliber players and they were able to schedule a full season of games thanks to the diligence of their charismatic business manager, George Dover. Importantly, they were able to secure Glenwood Park, Ogden's finest field, for home games. And because of its collection of talented players, largely brought together by the railroad, a number of teams willing to play them in northern Utah, a well-organized entity that supported them, a respectable fan base, and good fields to play on, Ogden Assembly had one of the most productive black baseball seasons in 1905 in the entire western United States. And here's some of the other amateur or independent, barnstorming teams in the West during this era. And more than a mere novelty, black baseball in the western United States, as throughout the country, was alive and well in the early 1900s. With teams at military forts to teams representing mining, railroad, and other working class urban and rural communities to everything in between, these teams were a reflective slice of American society and culture. A prime example and a local byproduct of that greater phenomenon, Assembly played a vital role within that mix, just like their successors would become over the next several years. The time was right for a serious black team in Utah, and Assembly was that team and the beginning of something much greater. Assembly did not disband in 1906. Rather, they reformulated as the Salt Lake Occidentals, their successors, as most of the new great Occidentals team were former Assembly players. The Salt Lake Occidentals team of 1906 through 1911 was the preeminent black baseball team in the entire western United States. They are often noted as the Rocky Mountain champions, the West Coast champs, the fastest team west of Chicago, the Utah State League champs. Here's a picture of the Occidentals with legendary champion boxer Jack Johnson. And, here's another photo of the team on Commercial Street in Salt Lake City. And the Occidentals team, you may know, were recognized and celebrated last year by the Salt Lake Bees. And as noted, many Ogden Assembly veterans moved over to this new Occidentals roster. And just as Gann and Burns did much of the pitching and catching for Assembly in 1905, they did the same for the Occidentals. Both teams played many of the same opponents. The Occidentals made regular visits to Ogden's Glenwood Park. Joe Burns served as assistant manager for the Occidentals, just as he did with the Assembly Club. And when Assembly players joined the Occidentals, newspapers made it a point to recognize that player as being Assembly fame. Black social clubs connected to Assembly, the Assembly Social Club, were associated with the Occidentals. And although it would have been great to see Assembly continue in Ogden in 1906 and what might have been, it made sense that as the team positively evolved, that they moved to Salt Lake City, as it was the epicenter of the still limited Black population in Utah, not to mention more teams to play against and fields to play on in the capital city. And after the 1911 breakup of the Occidentals team, many of the former Assembly and Occidentals players went to play for other notable African-American teams in the 19-teens in places such as Portland, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., to name a few. And the fact that such talented all-Black teams, Assembly and Occidentals, were created in the Intermountain West, in Utah of all places, and played so well for so many seasons is just remarkable, in my opinion. I think they could have matched up against any Black team in the country at the time, and there were some good ones. The Assembly team came together, with their varied backgrounds and at times through trials and hardship, during a moment of change in Ogden's history to prove themselves on and off the ball field and to enjoy America's favorite pastime. Additionally, as the Assembly team evolved into the Occidentals in 1906, and as the Occidentals Baseball Club grew, by 1908, they expanded their sporting pursuits by organizing the Occidental Giants football team, later known as the Occidental Tigers, in 1911 and 1912, and created junior-level baseball and football teams. In 1910, the football squad was managed by Joe Burns' brother, Ollie Burns, and they are captained by quarterback Walter Washington, who also managed the junior-level Occidentals Baseball Club. Thus, more than just a mere reflection, Assembly and the Occidentals were reacting to a society that had largely shut them out. Significantly, along with other baseball and boxing endeavors, with their organization of football and creation of junior-level teams, they were able to establish a compelling Black sports enterprise system within the state of Utah, as demonstrated here as an important social movement, if you will. BYU professor and sports historian Richard Ian Kimball noted in his article on heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson, the tactic of using sports to create a community identity became commonplace in American cities and towns during the 20th century. The Ogden Assembly and Salt Lake Occidentals team also laid a foundation for later teams, such as the Ogden Colored Giants in 1920 and 1921, the Salt Lake Tigers in the 1920s and 1930s, led by Herman Whaley, and they would later change their name to the Occidentals to honor the old Occidentals team. The Salt Lake Monarchs and Elks of the 1940s and 1950s, led by Willie Stewart. This team would also later become known as the Occidentals. The late 1940s Sahara Village Giants, led by star player Algie Bell, and they were composed of men who were stationed at Hill Air Force Base and lived in the nearby Sahara Village neighborhood. And also teams off the Wasatch Front, like the Sunnyside Monarchs, made up of men who worked in local mines who played in the Integrated Carbon Coal League in 1943, led by Andy Pearson, who had earlier played for the Salt Lake Tigers along with his brother Floyd. And as I previously noted, junior level teams such as the Salt Lake Junior Occidentals in the 19-teens and the Salt Lake Junior Tigers in the 1920s. To understand Utah and Western society, one need not look further than baseball history. These teams formed a legacy that deserves a closer look. And just one more thing I wanted to mention as a bit of a postscript, since it was big news just last year, Major League Baseball finally incorporated the statistics of more than 2,000 players who played in the official professional Negro leagues through the 1920s through the 1940s into the professional Major League Baseball records book. Although there were no official professional Negro League baseball teams in Utah or the West, just the semi-pro and amateur teams, like I mentioned. There were a lot of teams east of the Mississippi River, but one player who played for the Salt Lake Occidentals in 1910 and 1911, first baseman Tule McAdoo, later went on to play for the St. Louis Giants in the 1920s. And St. Louis was part of the official Negro Leagues, the Negro National League to be exact. So his personal stats are included in the official MLB record book, which I think is pretty awesome. So yeah, thank you for your time and listening today, and thanks to the Utah Historical Society.
Thank you, Chris. So at this time, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the question and answer key on the bottom of the Zoom meeting or in the chat. But I know I wanted to ask a question that I asked you earlier, and if you could expand on it more. I think one of the questions that arose to me when I was reading your article is, why did you decide to research baseball, specifically Black baseball in Utah?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a baseball history geek, and I love baseball. I also, do a lot of research and writing on Ogden and Utah history. And it was actually as I was doing some other research, actually for some work related stuff I was doing in Ogden on some historic buildings, I came across some articles from 1905 in the newspaper about this team. So I just kind of clipped those articles and set them aside at the time. And, I just, on my free time, started to delve into the team. And, I wasn't expecting a whole lot, as, I do this a lot and it just so happened that the more I found out about the team and the players, kind of the bigger the project became. And, I just felt like there was some significance with the team, and I just kind of snowballed and ended up doing a lot of research, and it just all came together. And I like I mentioned, I've been a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, and I reached out to some of the Negro League scholars in that organization, and they became interested in it and encouraged me. And I got to go speak at one of their conferences a couple of years ago on the topic, and so yeah, it just kind of evolved. But yeah, it's just my interest in baseball history and Utah history just kind of all came together with this topic. So it's been fun.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And we have a question from Wendy. She asks, what was the most surprising thing you have discovered through your research?
Yeah, so I don't know that. I mean, the one thing I would say is just the the lives that these players live. What an impact they had in Utah history and the West, as I kind of alluded to. I mentioned the lives of a few of the players, but I mean, they were just touching so many different aspects of important parts of our history. Like I said, Joe Burns' dad, he was a servant for Abraham Lincoln. Hayes Gann, being connected with the Coram Tufts family in Los Angeles. The stuff that these guys were doing in Salt Lake and in Ogden, and it's just like I said, not much has been written on the lives of a lot of these men, and just discovering the history, and I'm not surprised that they lived these important lives, but just how much history they were involved in terms of the bigger events that we're aware of, too. And um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate, especially in the article, but you also did it here where you concentrated on some of the players and really wrote about their lives and you gave them life, so it's great because sometimes people in history, we just see a name or they're part of this baseball team, but it's really nice that you did a lot of research on them. And again, you gave them a spotlight and shared with everyone who they were. Um, Another question I have, so I know you mentioned, baseball and boxing was really big, especially within the Black community in Utah, maybe the nation. But why specifically, baseball and boxing? Were there other sports that Black Americans in Utah were involved in at the time?
Yeah, so around in the early 1900s, I mean, boxing and baseball overall, those were the two biggest sports in the nation. Football, had gotten underway. Like I mentioned, the Occidental started a football team, but it wasn't as popular. Basketball was just kind of getting its footing. Horse racing was really popular, in the 19th century, and that kind of carried over into the 1900s a little bit. But baseball overall in American society, I mean, it just became, America's, of course, favorite pastime, and boxing was right there with it. So those were just the two most popular sports, and uh, you know, um, the African American community just picked up on them as well, and were able to gain grounding, in them. And there's money to be made, boxing. They could, make good money boxing, and not as much money in baseball, but there is a little bit more opportunity for more to play baseball. So that was really driving factor for a lot of them who got in the boxing ring or played on baseball teams as well.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact number, but I think you came across maybe four or five more um, baseball teams that were specifically with Black Americans. How does that compare to other teams? Like, were there a lot more baseball teams in Utah that were only white Americans, or
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, there weren't a lot of, individual black players playing on integrated white teams. There were just, some white teams were willing to bring in some of the better, African American athletes to play on their teams. Some were willing, but most of them weren't. They didn't show up on a lot of the white teams that were, playing here in Utah, but they did on occasion, like I mentioned, bring in some of the better players. I'll also say too, researching the Salt Lake Occidentals, which was kind of interesting, kind of later on, especially when they were playing in the winter leagues in Los Angeles. They brought in a few pitchers who were white to play on their team. So occasionally they had one or two white players, even though they're an all black team. So kind of worked on that end as well. So
yeah.
yeah.
Um, so what's next after this? Are you continuing more research on this specific topic? Um,
Yeah. It's very time consuming, and so I'm always researching something, especially baseball history. I've researched a lot of different topics pertaining to baseball history. And, I do think something more needs to be written about the Salt Lake Occidentals team. There's so much out there, and they were so active, and there's so many stories to tell about the team from 1906 to 1911. So eventually in the future, if somebody else doesn't pick it up, I'd love to do more, writing on the Occidentals team. But also, there are a lot of other teams and players and errors in Utah's baseball history too that I'll continue to research, slowly, and put stuff together. But yeah, I can't peel away from it, too much. So it's a labor of love. So yeah, I'll just keep continuing, and I'm sure I'll find, you know, other topics as well to to write about. So
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Chris. I really enjoyed learning more about the team and the history of Black baseball in Utah. As I mentioned earlier, I live in Ogden, and I really, don't know a lot of this history. Didn't know that Lauren Farr Park and Glenwood Park, are so close and have such a history behind it. Um, yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you again, Chris, for presenting your work with on the for Utah Historical Society Perspective Speaker Series. And yes, everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.
thank you.